Okay, so thank you everybody for coming along. I can't actually see everyone's face, so I'm just going to stick with 4 people. So Jenny, if something's going wrong, just wave at me. So this is the session on reading Hospicing Modernity with the CERN Aotearoa reading group. This reading group came about after the winter school in 2022. We had people in Christchurch for the New Zealand in-person node, and then we did some Zoom-ins with the Australian online node. I remember definitely on the last day we were Zooming and chatting. And so from there we started this iteration of a reading group, and we meet on the last Friday of every month, and we've been setting different papers that we want to read. Sometimes we've actually had authors of the papers there as well, which has been cool. And then this was the first book that we decided to read. So we started reading Hospicing Modernity in January this year and finished in August. So today we'll do a brief overview of the book by me, and then we'll have 2 people giving their response to the book, a 5-minute break, 2 more people, Heather's response, and then opening up to everybody to have a discussion. So we probably won't take up the 2 hours, but we'll see how we go. And then this picture here is a screenshot from one of our latest Zooms, but there's a lot of other people that have been involved in reading Hospicing Modernity and in the reading group, sort of popping in and out when they can. So there's a lot more faces involved. So it seems like everyone's read or is reading Hospicing Modernity, so this might just be a refresh, but this is the contents page, and so I've got 2 parts, the warm-up prep work and then part 2, Hospicing Modernity. And so just a note on Vanessa, the author. She is a professor at the University of British Columbia. Her research examines relationships between historical, systemic and ongoing forms of violence and the inherent unsustainability of modernity. And also what's important here is her mixed heritage of German and Indigenous ancestry from Brazil, which informs a lot of this book, and sort of talking about her 2 grandmothers and her parents and their lives and how that's informed her life as well. So that's important to note. So first part of part 1, the prep work, part 1 is who is modernity. So in a simplified way, modernity is defined as a single story of progress, development, human evolution, and civilization that is omnipresent. And Vanessa talks about how this conditions what and how we think, feel, desire, relate, hope, and imagine. And another point within this is that Vanessa talks about modernity as sort of a who rather than a what. So a living entity or a living story or system that actively does things, which I think was important to note. And then in prep work 2, we're sort of thinking, well, why should we read this book or not? And there's no political ideology that she wants her readers to align with. In fact, she doesn't really care about having a following. This quote I feel like was quite classic to see in this book, sort of, I lovingly don't care about what you think, but I care, I actually can't see the rest of the quote because everyone's face, but I care deeply about our collective capacity to dig deeper and to relate wider. So there's sort of this sense, which is quite, well, you're sort of used to an author telling you why to get on board, and she's not doing that. And there's these persistent warnings about why maybe it's not the right time for you to read the book. That seems to echo quite a lot through the book, which is an interesting component. So in prep work 3, the most important chapter, Vanessa outlines these 7 different tools for witnessing modernity. So move everyone's faces again. Oh. So we've got mastery and depth education, wording and wielding the world, the bus within us, layering existence and experience, low and high intensity struggles, generative disillusionment and exile capacities, and then co-sensing with radical tenderness. So these are outlined within this part of part 1, and then you apply those tools in part 2 of the book. And so another important component of this book are the exercises, which are in all the different chapters and sort of come in different forms. And so this one here is an example from the Bus Within Us tool. And I feel like the Bus Within Us it sort of resonated with our group quite a lot, and it was drawn on a lot during the book. And so the purpose of this tool in particular is to think about the different sort of people, or sort of the experiences and the people and the voices that we hold inside, and how that sort of plays out and how we interact with what's going on around us. So that could be life experience or important people in your life. And so it's about checking in with those different people on your bus and who they are, what their age is, what their tolerances are, what are their desires. So that's just one example of one of the tools there. And then part 2 of Hospicing Modernity is 10 chapters full of their own stories and exercises. And so, it's sort of applying, you get the prep work at the start, apply those tools in different ways into those different chapters. And it explores a whole lot of topics and scenarios as well. So how we engaged with this book, we used the exercises as sort of a point of, sort of had each exercise on a slide, for example, on a Jamboard. So that was a good way to collectively come together and put all of our thoughts, sometimes quite messily. It was quite fun on these, and each different Jamboard would have different slides on them as well. And so these are examples of 3 different chapters that we did there. And so so that's sort of what an outline of the book is and how we sort of went about it. So next we'll hear about what different members thought of the book. So we'll start with Bahaman.
And Lila, I asked Heather if she'd time the 10 minutes.
Oh, cool.
For each of us. And I think if we go over a minute or 2, it's probably okay, because Raven and Nikolai can't make it today. So,
if you have like 1 minute left, I'll go like that. Is that okay? 1 minute. Okay.
Thanks,
okay.
Heather.
Should I start? Thank you, Laila, for the introduction, complete introduction. So in the first following minutes, I want to talk about 4 things about this book. How was the experience for me while reading it? What challenges or gaps I noticed, how I resonated to that, and my favorite chapter. Starting with the experience, it was more of a journey for me for 2 reasons. First, it was the first time that I was reading a book in a group, and it wasn't just me rushing through pages and just in my own head. So I had the chance to hear people's ideas, and it was like I was traveling in their mindsets and seeing, oh, this is how we can say it, this is how we can say it. And also because we would give a month between one or a couple of chapters, we had enough time to think about that. So that's one of the reasons it was a journey for me. And the second thing was the structure of the book itself. As Laila told, it has some very interesting and engaging exercises that makes you a part of the book. It's not like you are just observing things. You are a part of it. It was pretty much similar to one of those classes at school that you are actually creating something, doing something, rather than just sitting back and listening and learning and memorizing. So it was pretty much close to those classes for me as well. And it was kind of like yoga as well. You know how when we start doing yoga for the first couple of sessions and the instructor asks you to move some muscles and you didn't even know that exists, this book did the same thing to my mind. There were some thoughts and things flying around, and I didn't want to pay attention to them. But this book just made me go to those places, maybe not very comfortable, many times very uncomfortable, but telling me, okay, you see that exists over there. Let's work on that. Let's focus on that. That's another way that I experienced this book. As Laila mentioned, Vanessa starts the book by talking about her childhood, her roots. And maybe that's why when we started reading the book, I went back to my roots and my childhood as well. Most of the part, I wasn't reading it as a PhD student in a Western context. I was reading it as an Iranian girl. That's how I was seeing the book. Moving to the challenges and gaps, a part of it is about exactly what I said. This gap that I identified in this book, and I can see it in a huge part of literature, not just this book, is how when books and articles are generally talking about countries and people, specific countries and specific people are not there. And I couldn't find Iran and the story of Iran because I'm an Iranian over there, but I think other countries that are not modern and have never been colonialized, like Saudi Arabia, like Afghanistan, they cannot find their place over here as well. Although she's trying to be inclusive a lot, but I felt parts were missing when I was trying to shape my mind in a general way. Another thing that was a bit challenging for me, well, you read the book, you know, it can be confusing sometimes, and sometimes you really don't know what to do with your thoughts, but most of the time they go in a right place after you keep reading it. But one part that remained challenging for me was the way maybe too much negativity was toward modernity. There were times that we were reading it and I wasn't really sure that it's just modernity that is doing this. It was like too much focus on negative aspects of modernity. And there were too many times that I couldn't help but thinking, okay, my great grandmother, I know how she used to live, and comparing it with my life. And this is the result of a huge part of it is a result of modernity. Is it really that bad? Although she never says that she's going to talk about pros and cons of modernity. This is not what she's going to say, but this part kept coming to my mind when I was reading it, and it was challenging for me. Moving to how I resonate with this book, as I mentioned, Iran particularly is not there or something close to my culture. However, the stories, the challenges that she says are very much similar to what's happening in my own country as well. So there were many times that I could put examples of Iran on the Jamboard and talking about, okay, this is happening inside Iran. This is the challenge that we're facing. More than that, I could resonate a lot with Persian literature. And I'm talking about very old literature. Basically, I'm just going to talk about two of them, Shahnameh and poetries by Hakim Omar Khayyam. So why Shahnameh? When she's talking about trying to find other ways of seeing and the importance of stories, the first thing that came to my mind was this book. Shahnameh is actually the mythical story of Iran. The book is written more than 1,000 years ago, and it is based on books that are written even older than that. But when you're reading the book, the challenges that you can see over there, they are very much similar to what's happening right now. For example, what's happening in Gaza, people who are living next to each other, who you may think like basically the same people, they start having a war together. The beginning of Shahnameh started with something like that three brothers, two are fighting the other one, and these wars are going on and on. Maybe one of the ways that we can find the answer is by using that collective thought of different people, going deeper. Maybe we can find it in such scripts and see what did the hero do at that moment, or in some cases, what did normal people do? Because it's not all about just heroes and kings. It can be about very simple, normal people, and including women, although it was written 1,000 years ago. The second poetry thing is poets by Hakim Omar Khayyam. As you already know, she starts it at the beginning saying that this book is not going to give you a final answer. You have to accept uncertainty. You have to accept not understanding. Now, that part of my brain that is based on modernity maybe tells me, no, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. But the other part that is based as an Iranian goes back to this literature, goes back to these pieces of poem, and it calms down all of a sudden. Again, Khayyam wrote his poetries around 850, 900 years ago, but they are covering the same thing. I'm just going to shortly read over this one for you in Farsi and in English. اسرار ازل را نه تو دانی و نه من وین حرف معما نه تو خوانی و نه من هست از پس پرده گفتگوی من تو چون پرده در افتد نه تو مانی و نه من There was the door to which I found no key. There was the veil through which I might not see. Some little talk a while of me and tea there was, and then no more of tea and me. So he's basically saying the same thing. We are trying to find things, but maybe the whole thing is not even out there. Maybe we are talking about the wrong thing. We are asking the wrong question, not even finding the wrong answer. And the final part I'd like to talk about is my favorite chapter. It was definitely chapter 4, Faster Than Thought. Specifically the part that she talks about her experience with school children, how 4-year-olds can be very creative when they're asked questions, and they don't even necessarily give answers. They ask questions instead of just trying to find answers. While the same story, same questions for 7 and 8 years old, it will change into just, thank you, just answers. And it's like the education system puts our heads inside a box of what is right, what is wrong. And it was pretty much close to my own experience as well. That's the chapter I think I'm going to remember when years go on from this book. This is the chapter that I'm going to remember the most. That's it for me. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Bahaman. That was amazing. I'll flip to, oh, here. Okay, so I found that reading this book was an interesting one. I definitely applied the book to myself, and I think since finishing it, I can see it as a resource to reread it and then apply it to something other than just myself. But I think because of the nature of it, it was sort of necessary for me to go through it from like an individual level. And I also found that the group setting was a really interesting one with this book, because I think it held me accountable to think about the hard stuff, because I can imagine reading this and it asking you to dig deep, and I can imagine me just sort of going, okay, that's a bit tricky. But when you had to think, oh, what am I going to put on the Jamboard, and also from what I'm personally answering versus what I'm going to share with the group, what am I going to share, I think that was a very interesting component. And it did make me sit down and really think, rather than sort of going, So that was quite interesting. But what I really valued with this book is the way emotion was really focused on. And like what Catherine was saying about listening to your gut and your body, that really came through with this. And I thought, yeah, that I remember one exercise about reading part of the chapter, and the exercise was, okay, what do you smell? And it was talking about scent. And I was sort of going, I don't smell anything. I don't know. And she even says that in the exercise of how we've sort of lost that ability to think about our sense of smell. It was just, yeah, such an interesting experience. And I liked that it was more about taking note of your reaction rather than reading a book and then creating your response that's sort of edited. It was good to focus on the reaction that was coming out. And I definitely felt myself sitting in the discomfort and of what the author was sort of warning about. And then from finishing it, I noticed the stories of modernity. They sort of just popped up since reading the book, sort of different conversations, what I would expect my experience to be. We had a reading group where Jenny was talking to us about the Alpine fault line in New Zealand and what would happen in that scenario. And like, it wouldn't be like the Christchurch earthquakes that I experienced. It would be like full country devastation, like needing to look after yourself and get water and whatnot. And but I know that my initial reaction would be, oh, well, someone would come, you know. It's like all these different assumptions that we have, which I feel like was linked to modernity, and what I expect to experience. So I think for me, the reading of this book for the first time was definitely thinking about mapping my affective landscape, and understanding that for myself, or at least starting to, because that's an ongoing process. So yeah, for me, it was a struggle to not seek the comfort. I was sort of waiting for the moment at the end of the book that it might turn to a sort of what to do next. I feel like most books have that last chapter where it's like, I've just outlined all the problems and here I am with the thing that I think we should all do, and sort of go forth with that. And that never came, which yeah, I had to sort of think about, I'm sort of leaning more on hope, rather than sitting in the discomfort. So I think, yeah, that was sort of a lesson to really pay attention to the discomfort and learn to deal with that rather than seeking a comfortable hopefulness. So, and with this quote as well, I think it's a good point around thinking of this book for me as a resource and rereading it. And so I want to reread it. And maybe think more about the hospicing. I know the whole book's about hospicing modernity, but I don't think I was like really paying attention to that and applying it in that way because I was too focused on myself, which maybe that's modernity, I don't know. But yeah, so I think it would be cool to reread it and apply it in my own work, maybe in my research. And then the only thing that I sort of struggled with was, it sort of stuck out to me while reading this, how she sort of described modernity as having agency, and sort of, it just reminded me of the way that capitalism was spoken about. And so I was like, oh, I'm not sure, because don't we create modernity through practice? I'm not sure. But then I thought maybe that was the point of the hospicing of modernity, is that it's everywhere, but then everything felt like a symptom of modernity. So that kind of confused me a little bit, but maybe that's just the point that I have to accept is what she's doing. But yeah, I think those are all my thoughts. Basically, I need to reread it, and I'd like to, yeah, keep rereading it. That's my goal. Do we do a 5-minute break? Just checking with Jenny.
Yeah, well, what does everyone think? Shall we just take a 5-minute break, stretch our legs, and then Bahamin's saying no, keep going.
Okay,
All right,
well,
well,
I think it was interesting.
we can keep going. And well, we could.
Should we get everyone to do a thumbs up if we think that we could keep going?
Okay, seeing lots of thumbs up. Hi, Vanessa. Great to see you. Great. So, Lila, who was next? Heidi.
Right. Yeah. We're back at the book and we've been gone from it a while. It's been a really cool process to co-read the book, and I had so many emotions. So then I thought I need to plaster emojis all over my slide to show like what my brain was doing the whole time. And I had all sorts of emotions, but I mean, it's obvious to say when you do something in a group that you get so much out of it from other people's experiences. And I felt really privileged to hear, you know, people from different countries, ages, and experiences feeding that in, because I mean, that gave a lot of life to the book, and I think that's where it was coming from. And in the first place, the stories from people in other places. So that worked really well. When I started out, I kind of really struggled with this, you know, constant cautionary message, like, ooh, maybe you shouldn't read this book, and, you know, maybe you shouldn't read this book, and maybe you shouldn't read this book. And I'm like, enough already, you know, we're reading the book, we're going to read it. And maybe like Lila, I just wanted to proceed rapidly with the work and get onto it. So I kind of struggled in those first 3 chapters of the prep work, where it was like, you know, you might not be able to go to the end, etc. So it took me a while to get into stride with the book, with the gaps in between our group getting together to talk about it. And I was really focused, you know, as a PhD student at the start of my journey, I was like familiar with the fringes of the subject matter, like capitalism and modernity and colonization and all these terms and things. So I was really interested to see, you know, what are the answers going to be, and how is that going to be? How is my understanding of those things going to be broadened and, you know, enhanced? And so the book wasn't offering to move beyond those terms to find the answer. So that was hopeful. So in the first corner, I was really confused. Then I was like really like sort of angsty. And then I was like scratching my head, like, where are we going? What are we doing? And I thought that it moved into a phase of asking the reader, well, in my head being me, that was like, as a researcher, you know, it's asking you to think about your work, and, you know, are you contributing or enabling modernity, or are you working to challenge that? And so the exercises and the things we were working with, you know, we're providing those tools to examine that. And it also asks you to look at your practices and the way you do things and the places you're situated in. And I think that was really important to us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where our relationship with Indigenous populations has been really dramatically influenced by coloniality, which is experienced as violence for those Indigenous populations. So that's something that is really uncomfortable to be around or to think about. So it's quite at the forefront for me working in New Zealand. So when I'm doing my research, and interestingly, you know, just having gone through my human ethics application, I think the biggest chunk of my ethics application was focused on Maori as Indigenous people, and how that would be accounted for in my research, given the fact that I am not researching Maori specifically. Yet there's so much thought. I had to explain so much that I'm not the person to go in and do this, because I was so aware of being a white, middle-class, privileged person living in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's not my place to come in and ask people questions about that. So that was an interesting sidebar for me as I went through the process. So I think, yeah, I was wondering, how am I perpetuating modernity with the work that I'm doing in my research? And the book was a way to think about, to unthink and to rethink new ways of doing things. And that's what I was looking for. It was like, if parts of my brain are a muscle, it's like, how do I get to unsee and unknow a way of things that has been a part of my education for so long, to try and move into a new phase or a new way of doing things. And so then as you got the second part of the book, I enjoyed much more with the stories and applying the tools. And it encouraged me to question how I could assist with the hospicing of modernity and new knowledge creation. So that was quite hopeful, and that's when the ideas sparked and we finally got a happy emoji. So that was hopeful. And the book asks us to consider how we will allow modernity to die with grace, which is a nice idea to think that can happen, and that we can move into a different way of being in the world, with things like colonization and capitalism, which are always going to be present, I feel. And the book asks us, I felt like, are you brave enough to do this work, to assist in that process? And, you know, will you go against the cause to do those things? So that's where I saw the real challenge, not necessarily whether or not I should read the book, but I'm pleased to say I got over that. When I was running out of time before one of the sessions, I downloaded the audiobook, and have from time to time listened to that, and found that really helpful to let it kind of wash over me. And like others have said, the idea of going back and rereading the book and getting a little bit more out of myself and thinking about myself, I think I'll be able to think a bit more broadly about what's being advocated for or challenged with in the book. And so, in summary, I felt that for me, the book was about positionality, or what they refer to as hyper self-reflexivity. So a lot of it is about examining your own baggage, etc., or the bus exercise is the example of that, to see what it is that you might be bringing to a situation. So that's my experience of the book. And this is, I thought, the perfect place. I've never quite known what the upside down smiley face is for, but it's like, I think this is it, you know, hard work, you know, the book was challenging, etc., but in the end it was good. We will go back for more. Thank you. That's all from me.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. And I think I'm up next. Oh, Nikolai, he sends his apologies. He's not been well, but he said these are the two things that he would have talked about. And probably what's worth flagging for people is partly the reason this session has come about is because Bahamin's supervisor, who's now left to go to Melbourne, has been the book editor for New Zealand Geographer. And so he suggested that we might write a reading group review of the book. And so partly we did this session just as a way of pushing ourselves one step on from reading the book, to think about, well, if we were to write a review, what, you know, how would we start? And so the idea of doing this session was, you know, is, you know, we'll have a conversation about whether we want to go the next step and write a review or not. But certainly it's just worth noting that those were the two things that Nikolai said he would have talked about if he was here. Instead, you've got me, and I hope I stick around because my little whirly thing is doing a lot of whirling, and I did have trouble with the internet yesterday, so I hope I don't drop out. So Lila, I'll let you know when to move to the next slide. So they're the four things that I want to talk about, and I actually have got some notes written down, so I'm going to do a little bit of reading of my notes. I mean, partly because I don't feel very confident about what I've got to say. So I've got the reassurance of the written word just to help me. Okay, so firstly, in terms of context, I just want to say that I super appreciated reading this book in the context of the reading group, where a number of us didn't know each other. So it was a great opportunity to get to know people, to build up trust and a sense of connection. Even though we weren't doing it face to face, we were doing it via Zoom. You know, I feel really connected to people and sort of look forward to seeing what people look like in, as I learnt yesterday, IRL, in real life. Because, you know, seeing the face on the screen versus the person, it's going to be so intriguing when we get to meet. But one thing I felt as we were reading the book that was missing for me, and particularly as we were doing the exercises, was having a specific project or piece of work to apply the book to. So on the one hand, and I think Lila mentioned this, you know, a strength of the book is that it does ask you to look at your own habits and your own practices of thinking and feeling. But for me, in the context of sort of everyday life, it meant that I didn't have anything to hang the exercises onto. So there were no immediate pressing or thorny issues that I could use the book to help me think through or to feel through. And that's at least how I felt at the time. And I want to come back to this at the end, because I think I realize in doing the preparation for today that actually has shifted quite a bit for me. And this idea of not having a pressing or thorny issue that I could use the book to help think me through is, of course, reflective of my life of privilege, and I guess, if nothing more, reading the book is a really humbling experience of being reminded of how privileged a life some of us, us who are so-called lucky, we're lucky enough to lead. But I think what's more important with the book is it's also a constant reminder that we are so-called lucky enough because of those systems and assemblages of privilege that derive from modernity and coloniality. And so, if we call our circumstances luck, I think this is to perpetuate what Vanessa calls the constitutive denials of modernity and coloniality. And could you go to the next slide, Lila? And I just did a screenshot of where she talks about the constitutive denials that, make some of us feel like we can talk about the lucky lives that we lead. And it's the denial of systemic, historical and ongoing violence and complicity and harm, the denial of the limits of the planet, the denial of our entanglement with others, and the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the problems that we need to face together. And I mean, she does that. I can't remember that denial, the constitutive denials is from one of the first chapters of the book when she's starting to get people to do exercises. And so in this exercise, she asks which of the denials is strongest in your context of work, amongst your family and friends, which of the denials do you feel most prepared to confront at this moment, which I think is really nice, and which do you think is the most challenging denial for you and why? And I think in how she frames that exercise, to go from something like these major constitutive denials that make some of us think, oh, I'm so lucky, but but my luck is only because of other people's circumstances. She's got a really nice way of framing that exercise. And I think, in how she frames that, you get a sense of the generosity that she extends to the reader. And I think this sense of generosity comes from her understanding of how modernity and coloniality shapes us all. So if we can go to the next slide, Lila. So as she writes early on in the book, the intention is to offer different stories that can help us take a step back. This allows us to develop the dispositions to be taught by modernity itself, with honesty about its flaws and gifts, without trying to defend it, fix it, or prematurely replace it. In this sense, modernity is not a corrupt project of the West that needs to be defeated and replaced with a more righteous and virtuous non-Western alternative, but rather something that is now unevenly part of us, all of us, conditioning the ways we experience reality. And what I really like about this quote, and it's a current that is really strong through the book, is this very non-judgmental stance that she takes. She's got this sense that we are all in this together, for better or worse. And for me, I think there's a really nice parallel with community economies thinking and practice. And many of us will be familiar with the idea from a post-capitalist politics about working with an appreciative rather than a judgmental stance. And I think in Hospicing Modernity, there's also this appreciation that we're not making judgments about good or bad modernity or post-modernity, Rather, there's this really strong appreciation that in a sense, all we have to work with is what's at hand or what's at heart or what's in our gut. And that, you know, what's at hand and what's in our heart and what's in our gut has to a large but not complete extent been shaped by modernity and coloniality. But I mean, one thing that I want to add to this is that even though she takes this, you know, what I think is a really generous and an appreciative stance, she doesn't, and all of us have said this, she doesn't shy away from making us feel discomfort. And one strategy that she uses is to expose her own discomforts. So, for example, in one of the chapters in the second half of the book, she describes when she first met and spent time with Mama Maria in Peru. And since then, since that first meeting, she and her son have actually become part of Mama Maria's extended family. But when she first visited the relatively remote village, she wanted to get flush toilets installed. And as much as anything, this wish was a salve to her own sense of discomfort of having to hand Mama Maria a bucket each morning that contained Vanessa's own liquids and solids. And then pretty quickly, she wanted to foist onto the community an ethical tourism venture, which would have been this salve to her discomfort of having to sell handmade bracelets to unappreciative Western tourists. But that was something that Mama Maria wanted her to learn to do. So Vanessa describes her indignation at how poorly and patronisingly she and her fellow Indigenous vendors were treated by Western tourists. And she describes what happened when she explained the ethical tourism venture to Mama Maria. Can we go to the next slide, Lila? You know, and she says, I was a professor and I could do something. I mounted my imaginary high horse and with my hands defiantly on my hips outlined this ethical tourism venture. And the response from Mama Maria was just howls of laughter at sort of how ridiculous Vanessa appeared. And that's where that quote that we used in the session description comes from. The quote that in her laughter, Mama Maria had held back a mirror, and it was the first time I could see myself as cute and pathetic. And it was the most liberating thing I had ever felt. So, you know, when I read that story about and her discomfort on looking back at, you know, what she was like when she first arrived in the village, you know, there's for me so much discomfort at reading those lines and thinking back to all those times of knowing best, of knowing how best to solve a problem, of knowing the right solution that's needed, of knowing the next step in a process. You know, and I note too, those words, there's deliberately on my part the denial of an actor, a doer in those statements. You know, it should be that discomfort at those times when I thought I knew best, when I thought I knew the solution, when I thought I knew the next step. And, you know, it's such a classic modernist move in a way to obfuscate who's doing the doing and who's responsible. And especially, I think, when, you know, and I want to do the royal we, but it's not the royal we, especially when I'm the one who might be responsible. So, you know, I think she does make us really think about our discomfort at things that we may have done in the past, and will, you know, and I think she would generously say continue to do, because that's the nature of how we get shaped by being in something like modernity and coloniality that has been reliant on those, you know, so much on those constitutive denials. But what I want to note is that for Vanessa, what happens when she stops knowing best is that she learns an enormous amount about the economies of Mama Maria's community. And I think this is what she means in the quote about this idea of the most liberating thing, is that when she stops knowing best, she learns, for example, about the metabolic community that shit is part of. And she learns about the relational economy between the Indigenous vendors and the tourists who participate in the economy, and who Mama Maria sees as being like these poor, lost and confused creatures because, and these are Mama Maria's words, oh, you know, They don't know better. They believe money is everything, and they've got a long way to go. So there's a sort of really nice way in which she shifts who's doing the seeing at that point. And I want to draw a parallel here between how Vanessa deals with the importance of not knowing and the idea that's used in community economies work of strong and weak theory, and the idea that of always trying to approach a situation by refusing to know too much in advance. And so knowing too much is, of course, that strong theory of approach of knowing already how the world works because of all the theories we have got to explain things, and whether they're theories about cleanliness and how shit should be dealt with, or whether they're theories of Indigenous-based economies and how they should operate ethically. Instead, as community economies approach, I think, like Vanessa, advocates this, trying to be open to the unexpected and to what we don't know. I think what I want to do is sort of finish up by.
You're out of time.
Oh, can I? Thank you. I can't see because I've
Heather's
got
been
my
waving.
notes. Oh, I'm sorry. How long have you been waving for, Heather?
Like a minute. It's okay. Wrap it up.
Okay, can I wrap it up quickly? Let's go to the next slide. I might need 2 minutes, Heather, to wrap it up. And it sort of goes back to the beginning when I said about not having any sort of struggles at hand to be using when I was going through the book. And what she says in the most important chapter, Tool 5, is low and high intensity struggles. The book was written for those involved in low intensity and also low risk and low stakes struggles. If you have the time, energy, and literacy necessary to read this book, you fit this category. So it says, invitation to observe our habits of thinking and how these habits of thinking reproduce the harms of modernity and how we're complicit in it. And the next slide, Lila. And about, who's reading this book. The ideal scenario is for the exercises to help you see yourself from the perspective of those who have been harmed by patterns of modernity that you also reproduce, and who may think that your veiled or explicit arrogance, self-image, sense of self-importance are, plainly speaking, ridiculous. People who are socialized within modernity are terrified of hearing or sensing their own ridiculousness because modernity codes it as a form of demotion, humiliation, or belittlement. I invite you to experience the absurdity of modernity within and around you as a form of connection, endearment, and liberation from the grip of arrogance, as a way to laugh at yourself and be taught by the precarity, brokenness, and imperfection of our collective existence. But this is also an invitation for you not to turn your back to the shadows that become visible when placed in the spotlight. And, when I started reading this book, I kept thinking, who's the audience for the book? Who's it written for? And I will admit to an arrogance of thinking. I thought things like, oh, this book's not written for me. I know this stuff. I'm enlightened. This book is written for someone else, someone else who's ignorant. And then I'd think, oh, but, they wouldn't pick up this book. So why she even bothered to write it? So yes, I admit to my arrogance, my self-image, my self-importance, and I will try to laugh at the ridiculous of my thinking that, of course the book is written for someone just like me. So I, want to thank Vanessa for writing the book, and I want to thank the reading group for reading it with me. And I've done. So do we want to find out whether will Heather talk, or do we want to have a break? Thumbs up if you want a break.
I want a break.
Okay, and then we'll come back and Heather will, so we'll break for 5 minutes. Yep, and then Heather will come back and then talk, and then we'll open it up. Great. Thanks, everyone. Oh, my first row is back. And my second row is almost back. So we're doing okay time-wise, Lila? Yes?
Someone could time me for 10 minutes. Or should I
Okay,
get my timer?
Yeah, I can do that. Oh, no, looks like no, Heidi's doing it. Great. Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, Heidi, when I'm last down to 1 minute, give me the 1 minute, the finger. Sweet. So should I?
Well,
Only if
so
you're watching.
Hmm?
Only if you're watching, Heather.
Yeah, I'll try to watch.
So maybe I should explain that we found out about the book via, well, it was sort of on Stephen Healy's recommendation that we read it. And so Stephen agreed to sort of be a discussant, but then he had a series of workshops that meant he couldn't be here today. But then we found out that Stephen found out about the book via Heather. And then it so happens that Heather is our liaison person for this session. So Heather has wonderfully, at like 2 minutes to the start time, agreed to step in and be the respondent. But it's sort of nice given that Heather was it was Heather via Stephen that we found out about it. So thank you, Heather, for doing this. It's wonderful.
Okay. I've been writing down notes, so I'm just going to go through this, and I'll try, it'll be all over the place, but there's a really, I ran to the bathroom and then I was thinking, there's a wacky origin story for me with this book that's really meaningful. Came back, say it quickly, I came back from Glasgow, where I did 2 postdocs, back to work in so-called British Columbia, where I'm from, and I had this online teaching. So I hadn't lived where I grew up in the mountains since I was 18. I'm in my late 40s. Like, what the hell? Okay, so I go to this party and there's a professor there, and really annoying man, kind of mansplaining energy. And he's like, what you need to do is write some world-leading articles. And I was like, oh my God. And I literally felt like, and I turned around, and the first person I saw sitting on this couch, oh, and this is at a farm in this incredible valley run by these amazing anarchist farmers who are old, and they did radical food sovereignty work, and their daughter married into the local indigenous community, like a really neat family. So I'm at their farm, run from a mansplaining man, grab the first woman I see and start talking to her, and she's studying somatic therapy. So then I was like, I need a therapist. So she said, you should talk to the woman who's teaching me therapy, this woman, Terry Robertson. And so I started going to somatic therapy online during COVID. Okay, and then Terry said, there's an amazing program online. It's a workshop led by Bayo Akomolofe called We Will Dance into the Mountains. And he's a Nigerian theorist and poet. So I took that online, and there are amazing speakers in that, including Joanna Macy, the Buddhist environmentalist professor, and this writer of Hospicing Modernity was in it with another amazing Indigenous education scholar, Tyson Yonkaporta. So that's how I found out about the book, running from a mansplaining guy telling me to write world-leading articles to a somatic therapist on a farm led by some of my favorite food activists where I grew up. So I love that it's grown into this discussion. But I read the book once, and then I'm now reading it really slowly with 3 of my coworkers at Athabasca University, a sociologist, an arts professor, and a philosopher. And what we're doing is we're reading really intentionally and slowly, and we're responding every time we meet with our notes, but each time we do an art practice as well. Like, one of the very first chapters, we did a movement activity and filmed it about our own feelings around this and trying to get out of having smart, clever notes and, debate the book, but to try to where it sits in us. And we're all 4 of us are white women who've benefited from settler coloniality, from extraction industries. Our university's paid for by Alberta oil money. Like, we're highly complicit. So we're trying to think through with art practices and discussing. And what I love, I was writing notes and trying to time keep. But what I love what Bahaman was said, this is like, I love the yoga, like it's almost these practices. And what's wonderful about this book is really awkwardly trying these ideas out and doing these kind of scans of our shadows it's almost like this shadow work of modernity that shapes us at a cellular structure. And it's like the global intimate, like it's our everyday way we treat ourselves. and one another, and how this then shapes economies, and how do we slow down and really look at one another and the worlds we're making. And I appreciate what you're saying, Jenny. It's not a judgmental approach. It's looking at our ridiculousness and our goofy, like we're just caught in this. So I love the idea of, she writes about sitting with compassion, self-compassion, and care with each other, and calling one another in, and sitting with our awkwardness around this. And also the concept of hospicing, being with it. And I think of someone in the hospice, you're kind of you're letting this thing die, but with dignity, and try to learn what we can incorporate, what we can learn from this. It's not like killing modernity or just getting rid of modernity. It's hospicing. So one of the women in my reading groups said when her dad was passing away, she played him all his favorite country songs. So we're even joking about writing a country song for modernity and like what we've learned from it and where it can move on. But yeah, and all of you're all talking about the generosity and the discomfort of this work, and the book provides these wonderful practice tools to look at the flaws as well as the gifts of these structures that shape how we create our educational models, and we create how we mark papers and how we do our research. But what can we draw from these? What I love about her book too is she draws from her collective research. She worked a lot with a Cree curator named Elwood Jimmy, and they have another they extend this chapter. Can't think of it. I can post it after. They wrote another book about art curation and working across Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists, and it comes from one of these chapters. What I love about this work is about how do we think about thread sensibilities and brick sensibilities, and how a lot of institutionalized knowledge making and curational practices, art practices, have a brick sensibility of trying to build these structures, and they call for more of a thread sensibility. So threading and weaving, being hyper reflexive, being open to making messes, screwing up. And for me, as a white settler working with Indigenous colleagues and Indigenous students on stolen Indigenous land, really thinking through how to sit with these struggles, but not in a singular, frozen in constant self-reflexivity where it's almost like individually neurotic, but trying to use this as a way to critically reflect and then shape structures. And I love this idea of kind of moving, like the self-interrogation, but then moving to an act of self-compassion of the ridiculousness, and then shaping and moving around the structures and making real material change. So I think this book really goes from the personal to the larger structural, back and forth. And I think of this threading and undoing these heavy structures, but loosening them. What else did I write? Yeah, and I appreciate bringing in, the book is very poetic, and I love that, was it Bayman that ended also talking about poetry. There's another feminist scholar named Sarah DeLeo that writes about poetry and geography, and using so much of the horrors of settler colonialism are hard to capture in writing in like a social science way, but how wordplay, poetry, collage, like there's different modalities for really thinking through how complicated and how frustrating and painful these structures are. So I love how the book at the end, like the very final part, where she talks about growth and decay, pain and bliss, life and death, awe and horror. Like there's a constant mobilizing of poetry. And it reminds me a lot of Sarah DeLeo's work. It's hard to always have a good debate about this and follow the most recent hot decolonial way of writing. And there's something very decolonial about getting into the body and undoing and showing all these contradictions. What else did I write? Yeah, and Heidi's upside down smile, I think, captures a lot. It's an uncomfortable stretching like in the yoga class, you leave there smiling, but you're like, oh, it's hard, and the work's not ending. So I think thinking through also, yeah, how do we develop these capacities to sit with this discomfort without clear, 1 minute, without really clear and easy answers? Because like, I think one of you mentioned you're working where there's possible massive earthquakes. I was reading this and working with students who we were in 2021, we were on evacuation orders constantly from fires. And I actually was at an event with students, and we got a call telling to leave the fire. And then we were driving into the city, and the side of the hill of the city was on fire. So then we weren't supposed to go into the city, but there were literally fires kind of blocking the city, and just like living through that, and then meeting up with students talking about their work on Zoom about a mutual aid, but like literally people were leaving and coming and going. And I had students sandbagging their houses a few months later from the floods that came after the fires. So I've never experienced anything like that. And I think a book like this is one of many puzzle pieces we need to think through. How do we slow down and be with each other and create ways of knowing and undoing where we don't have the answers. And these are going to be very, very, very real situations that come up. And I've had the privilege of never experiencing anything like that. So there's something about this book. It's a puzzle piece for me of thinking about capacity building, and growth and unlearning and learning. But I hope that makes sense. But yeah, I read this and thinking about my new projects were really shaped by actually sitting through a couple years now of intense fires and floods. So yeah, so I think it's this book about getting out of the head and into the body, and then and the capacity of being kind and working through these things together. Yeah, how does that make sense? Ooh. Okay.
That seemed pretty coherent, Heather. Well done.
Okay. But I love that it did come from going to a party in this incredible valley, running from an annoying political science man that led to an awesome therapist that led to the book. Yay!
So I wonder whether others who've read the book want to say something. Swanima, even just, even though you've just literally been handed the book, maybe even the cover. And Kat, would be great to hear how.
So yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for asking me to speak. I think I was in two minds if I am the one who has read the book, or should I speak or not. So I think the session was a wonderful introduction for me to start. I've actually already started, but to complete the book. And the sense that I got was it's something that will help me do self-assessment of where I am in my work, and what is it that I am reproducing when I am working with Indigenous spaces, in Indigenous spaces. Am I giving them a piece of the modernity I carry or not? And that becomes very important, because even if you're working, especially if you're working for a very long time in a certain space, you stand on slippery grounds. You sometimes feel that you know too much and you know enough, and you sometimes feel that I don't know what to do. So in that regard, I think this book has come to me at a very special time, at a very important time, when I am reflecting on what I did for all these years, and a good critical reflection of myself, of have I really imparted a sense of modernity that I didn't want to impart to these spaces, and will I continue to do it? how will I stop it? So maybe that is my takeaway from the session and from whatever I have read of the book. Yeah.
That's wonderful, Swanima. And actually, and just as you were speaking, as I was sort of thinking about the book and writing up the notes, I kept thinking, Kat, of in your work how you've used that statement: leave the villagers alone, leave the villagers alone, leave the villagers alone. And it did that refrain just, you know, kept coming to me as I was thinking about some of those things that she had written about. But Vanessa, you had your hand up.
Yeah, during their 5-minute break, I switched to another computer so I could actually interact with y'all. So it's great to be here. And my kind of origin story for encountering this book was through Heather. So your story led into my story, because over the summer winter school, we had that conversation, the mentor meeting where you mentioned this. And I ended up putting it on my comprehensive exam list, which I'm writing right now. So it was just this moment of like looking over my shelf and like when I was starting my paper 3, and I just saw this book and I was like, that's the one. I need to start right here. And I am so glad that I did, because I think that I'm writing about, like, thinking about kind of like my entry into the resilience debates right now, but trying to enter it with like a post-human and human like sensibility. And this book just felt exactly right, in the sense of there are some things that, you know, resilience sometimes implies this like holding on, when there are some things that we're actually like really like letting go of, and what's a different way of being that is perhaps returning like a longer resilience that we are experiencing or being a part of, or not, or just like a different kind of becoming. So like rethinking of resilience as a becoming. And so yeah, I just want to start there and say, Heather, thank you, because this has been really helpful. And I appreciated Lila, and your presentation where you mentioned one concern that you felt. I felt this too, the way in which like we can sometimes make capitalism like the big monster that's all consuming. I did feel sometimes that there were ways in which like modernity just becomes this thing that's massive and just contains all the things that we're critical of. But then I also appreciated Jenny, in your presentation, the ways that she also then breaks it down into these like humanly workable like encounters and moments at the same time. So like both of those things are happening. And I thought that this chart, the heads up chart on page 78, where she's, you know, writing about like the single story of Forward and like the kind of development politics circles that she was in, which reminds me kind of as of that like community economies way of breaking down capitalism into you know, these more specific components. And then also the way that she then like with a lot of care and complexity was explaining that, well, if you're like a nonprofit development organization and you try to like all of a sudden not do all of these things, you then become unintelligible in that very system, which can make it hard to then do important work and like funnel funds and all those, you know, kinds of things that orgs are trying to do. And I appreciated just that, like sitting with, you know, we can accept these critiques and like think about them on one level, and then also there's just still an endless number of questions in terms of the what now, and what does that look like on a daily basis of sets of relations over a day. So yeah, thank you all so much, and that's what I'm thinking about right now.
Great. And Vanessa, I think that Heather might have given you another gift in terms of thinking about resilience as, instead of holding on, a letting go. I think the brick and thread metaphor works really well with that. So our gift giver, Heather.
Yeah, but towards braiding here, the decolonial futures towards braiding. And also the deck of cards and like the whole, if you look through their website, there's wonderful education tools they've made. But I'm so glad, this is me going on and on about this book. Interestingly, too, what you're saying, Vanessa, on the back, it said for people who read Emergent Strategy and Against Purity. And the same people who I'm reading with now, we read Against Purity. And that book also reminds me very much of community economies thinking around working where we're at and working, like there's no pure radical place to retreat to. It's working in the here and now and using our resources to build something new, even in structures that can feel really complicit. But like this, I love that about the community, diverse economies work is working, starting where we are. Sorry, Catherine, I think I just talked over your yellow hand. So
No, totally fine, Heather. Thanks. I was just gonna I don't know, there's so much to say. I sympathize so much with the reactions that you all spoke about in reading the book and the kind of the discomforts and the yoga. I mean, that was a beautiful analogy for how it feels. I mean, when I was reading it, on the one hand, I found it quite cathartic. I did get annoyed. I got a little bit annoyed because the critique that she's leading us through is a critique that for me, I feel well saturated with already, you know. So I felt a little bit patronized sometimes in the language that she used, assuming that we were all coming to this for the first time in our lives. But on the other hand, the fact that she's brought it all together into one volume with all these thought experiments for us to engage with, I think is also really, really powerful and really, really helpful. And bringing into that whole conversation this idea of hospicing is really beautiful. And I've found it so helpful to sit with that. I actually read it alongside listening to an audiobook version of, and I was just looking it up on my Audible account, a book called Listen by Catherine Mannix, who works in hospicing. So she's coming from a medical background, but she's talking about the skill of listening, of deep listening with people, and particularly, you know, using a lot of cases from her work where it's the families of people who are dying. And that, so bringing those two together was amazing. Because in my work, I'm just constantly in that struggle of how do you help this awful creature to die, yet still work in it and perform it and choose the moments in which you can be resistant and be a bit radical, and the other moments where you have to speak the language of modernity in order to be heard. And it's very awkward and constantly uncomfortable. And I'm constantly instinctively wanting to fix things. So this idea that no, you don't fix. You recognize and you listen. And that kind of really profound listening has been great. But I'm hearing everyone talking about, okay, so what do we do with it? So it's still the sense of, okay, how do we move forward? How do we do tomorrow? Without trying to fix it, without trying to remediate this dying beast that we're in the midst of. And that, I think, is a harder thing to do. But I also was reading it in the midst of doing this work that I mentioned in the introduction with David Spillman and Ben Wilson, who are both senior lawmen of Karakiyu country in northwestern New South Wales. And they've been working with school teachers and schools and kids on learning how to listen to country and how to learn from country. So for Aboriginal people, the teacher, then all knowledge that we have comes from country. And you access that knowledge as you learn to still yourself and connect with country and receive from country. And it will come to you through dreams. It will come to you with the elders who will share stuff. And also, and this one is something that I have heard my colleagues speak about, but I can't quite believe, you will have direct conversations. The trees will speak to you directly. And so the skill, what you do is you don't do, you listen. And the next thing, the what you must do, the action you have to take in your life will become very clear as the next step. You know, it's not that you have to fix a problem and think it through and get the model that's going to apply and the blueprint that's going to work. It's a much slower thing. And so I'm trying to think about how do you take that practice into something like what I'm doing right now, which is writing a final report on a project that's going to go to the Department of Foreign Affairs to tell them how to do their development programs in Papua New Guinea. You know, like, oh, these things don't fit well, but I'm trying. And yeah, the book's a really helpful talisman, I think, and touchstone for figuring that out. That's all.
That's just wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Kat. And I see Heidi, you've got your hand up. Yep. And then maybe Christian, would be good to hear from you if you'd like to say something. You've been nodding your head there. Yeah.
Thank you. Just quickly, I just wanted to add in that one of the things that I was a little bit preoccupied with, and I don't know whether it's the guilt factor again, but then also thinking what the book offers in terms of maybe we're not trying to kill modernity, and that if you consider hospicing, if you consider hospicing as moving on to the next life or something, what is that future state? Because if you look at the white privilege that's been experienced by some, which has been meant violence for others, when do they get their chance as well? So it's like, and that's the thinking that I try to do with capitalism as well. Like, you can't just kill it, you know. So that's one thing that sort of comes through in the book for me too. Thank you.
So I'll just jump in and say, first off, thank you for organizing this session. I really appreciated everybody's reflections, and it's really thought-provoking. As others have said, a lot of things that could be said here. I definitely, so my story, I don't know, Heather, did you tell Sarah Smith and Pavi about the book by any chance? No. Okay. So I heard about it from another network of geographers who I think were reading it as part of their reading group. And I had it in my summer reading alongside some other books that were also like fairly heavy and engaging with questions of like climate futures and forms of narrative and practice that are necessary for this future. So in my head, I kind of conflate those two. And, you know, I can't quite remember if in this book, the case was made very directly that modernity, in the face of sort of climate breakdown and some of the things Heather was describing, it is inevitably dying, and will inevitably be, you know, replaced by something completely unstable that we're going to need a lot of different thought tools and forms of practice to be able to deal with. But I think I found myself reading it through that lens and sort of thinking in those terms, and then thinking along the lines of what many of you have said, that is a process that cannot be done from within the terms of so many of the tools that currently exist or that are, you know, dominant in the institutional spaces that I'm in. So I definitely found myself wanting to like read this with other people as part of a project of thinking about what needs to be hospiced. There's also a gesture to midwifery and what needs to be brought into being. And, you know, I kind of thought about like doing that at my university, like Heather talked about, which raised the question of like, whether our own critiques and tools would be adequate without bringing in some other perspective that helped to destabilize and unsettle the things that we would reach for in those conversations. But I also did find myself wondering, like, if I did this with community collaborators, if they would be irritated by some of the language. For instance, I'm working with like people who think really seriously about like Black and Indigenous relationships to land and struggle and displacement. And I would love to read it with them, but I also wouldn't imagine to suggest that they should take their time to do that so that I could benefit from it. And I wonder how that process would go. So yeah, I just had a lot of thoughts and questions about like what the next step would be and who I could have conversations about this with in a way that would continue to sort of deepen and do the listening and a lot of the things that you all have gestured towards. And then I saw this session and I was like, oh, these would be fantastic people to think about this stuff with. So thank you very much for the conversation and for all the presentations. I really appreciate it.
That's great. Thanks so much, Christian. So thoughts to what's been said. One thought I had, and this was from something you said, Lila, and then it's been picked up a few times by people. The sort of some of the annoyances when reading it. At times I kept putting my sort of community economies hat on and wanting to go, oh, it's not modernity, it's multiple modernities, and it's not coloniality, it's multiple colonialities, and why are you bundling this all up as one thing? And in the end, I thought, that's me. That's my issue to work through, and I'm just going to accept this is what she's working with. And in a way, she is talking about multiple modernities, because she is not saying that it's necessarily one complete thing. But I just thought, in a way, I just thought, shut up, just go on as you said, Bahamin, go on the journey with her. And it did make me think that we had somebody come into the reading group about midway through, and they sort of got invited in sort of partly by mistake. And there was suddenly this whole sort of academic critique of everything that was wrong with the book. And I think those of us who were there, we were all a bit like, oh my God. What do we say? It was like so not the way that we'd engaged with the book, which was, I think, to take it slowly and to work through the exercises and just in a way just give it a go and not stand back and say, oh, I'm going to critique this from my academic vantage point. So that was was nice just to be reminded, oh yeah, we are sort of reading it differently and we are trying to do work with it, even if we're not sure what the work is that we're doing with it. So yeah, I wanted to say that about the things that, and yeah, you just have to let go of and say, I'm going to go with this.
It's funny you say that about the modernity word as well, because it's making me think I've been every time these Indigenous colleagues of mine are working on a paper, they always open it with like, capitalism is is the big evil. They run that line, and I'm constantly saying, can we change that language? Let's think about this a bit differently, and have offered up to them the Vanessa's modernity as an alternative catch-all for all of these processes, kind of in one basket, as it were. Yeah, so I've found the catch-allness of it quite useful in that way. Yeah, it's because capitalistic practices are a subset of the modernity that she describes, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of would be an interesting exercise, sort of academic exercise to sit down and go through about that relationship between, you know, so-called capitalism and so-called modernity. Yeah. But you know, you have to use terms strategically, and because of what they enable you to do.
Yeah, I think that's what I got to it by the end of it, was that was her strategic decision. And yeah, trying to let that go. But I also found it really confusing because I felt like every reaction that was to be had, she sort of said, I felt like she sort of like said what reaction would happen and then what it meant if you had that reaction. So I was getting confused because she wasn't there, obviously, but I'm reading what she's writing. And I'm like, she's already predicting, and like, is this how I actually feel, or am I just disguising things? Or like, it was just such a funny type of book to try and reflect, but then be judging my reflections. And it's like, yeah, I don't know. Rereading it, I think I'd try and do that differently. But yeah, it was just such an interesting one.
I just
Well,
appreciate the idea of trying to hospicing modernity and birthing something new, but this don't want it, not that it's going to be virtuous, or like there's such the language we use, like best practices, or like you want to have it clear and coherent, but letting that go. And there's just so many ways yeah, you just see there's kind of your neural pathways, your cells, your bodies. You want to have a clear, coherent path, but learning to be open to just open. And I love what Catherine was saying, like learning from plants and dreams, and how disconnected settlers are from those experiences and how to relearn them. But that disconnection, which has led to so many of the anxieties that have led to violence against one another in the land, and extractive and competitive, very grabby and anxious ways of being with the world, but trying to undo that and to go. But there's just so much going on there. But this, yeah, not then having a virtuous or like a really good critique or a better way, or like that I feel that it's that's the anxiety and the fear of not knowing and how to undo that. And I thought this book just really touched on that in ways I haven't really experienced in many academic texts. Like it's very embodied, very grounded that way.
So maybe we could wrap up by doing a go round and just a word or two of what you might say to Vanessa about her book. I've just made that up on the spot, but I think that could sort of be fun. What would we say to the author? Has anyone got any immediate thoughts?
Did you get
Maybe.
hate mail?
What's that?
Did you get hate mail after writing the book?
Yeah. I wonder if she's on social
response.
media.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would thank her for the productive confusion.
Yeah. Heather, what would you say?
I don't know, like go to the cracks and the decay, like bleh, go in there. I like that.
Lila, what would you say?
Yeah, I'd probably thank her. I don't know what else. Just thanks. And then be awkward and cute and pathetic. Probably.
Kat.
Yeah, I think it would be expressing gratitude again for it's quite something to create a space in which you invite your reader to enter into a discomfort and not offer any out. It's a really brave and obviously an incredibly powerful and productive gift.
Yeah. Vanessa.
I think, well, I would thank her a lot. And also, if I had an opportunity to ask her a question, I'd be really curious to ask about her writing about pleasure, because it's often just kind of incorporated in lists alongside things like comfort or consumerism, in ways that I think, like, especially since you pointed out that the comparison to emergent strategy on the back, when that framing of these kinds of ideas is so much more of also like embracing pleasure. I think that I'm curious about that and the conflation of pleasure with comfort and consumption. That'd be, I guess that's what I would ask her, and then see what comes out. But overall, excited about the overall message and the kind of possibilities that it tickles my brain with.
Right. Swanima.
Oh, I think where I am at the moment with the book, I'm going to thank Vanessa for creating a bridge with my past. With when I was growing up, I think, to where I am, that is what I'm going to say to her.
Lovely. Christian.
I would definitely say thanks and be grateful, but I would also love to hear more about some of the experiences working through some of this stuff within some of the collectives that I know that she's a part of. And then I would just love to hear more about that, details, protocols that they use, other things like that.
Yep. Bahamin.
Well, I said I would thank her for the productive confusion, and maybe
That's what you did, yes.
Yeah, and maybe I introduced Persian literature to her as well.
Great idea. Heidi, did you want to say something else?
Something sensible. I think I would be interested to find out about how the book had come across with Indigenous populations, and how what the response had been and how they had responded. Yeah.
Yep. And I think like, yes, like everyone, I would thank her, and I'd sort of be interested to know, you know, how she put it together in her head, like what, because she draws in lots of threads together. So I'd sort of be interested to know, you know, what the initial spark was for doing it, and how she drew in different thoughts. And I suppose what her fears were around doing this would sort of be interesting to know. Maybe the fear of hate mail, but you know, what were the sort of, what did she feel she might be putting at risk, perhaps? So I think that means we're at the end of the session, and I see Swanima just wrote a message. She's off to catch a bus. So it is Thursday afternoon here. It is Wednesday evening in other parts of the world. It'll be late for you, Vanessa. So thank you, everybody, for contributing. And thanks. It's great to have people who've read it, and great to revisit it again with the reading group. So thank you, everybody, for coming along and participating.